Death Riders are the cavalry element of the Death Corps of Krieg, selected for their aptitude of thought, tactical flexibility, and skill with arms. They are often the most elite troopers fielded as recon elements, as well as line breakers, or just any sort of rapid, tactical, flexible unit needed. Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling. Today we'll be doing a painting video, lore video, and a rules video on the Death Riders for the Imperial Guard. I will be painting them in my own regiment's colors, not the traditional Death Corps colors. I am starting from gray for a myriad of reasons, mainly because gray allows us to build up multiple colors far easier than black or white would, and in general is just a bit more flexible than either of those two, though is a little bit less forgiving than black and not as vibrant as white. You will notice that the one of the reins is actually a different color. That's because I forgot to put it on before I primed him, so he was primed with a brush. We're going to start off by painting the horse, of course. That wasn't meant to rhyme, but it did anyways. We're going to make heavy use of contrasts here, mainly because the slightly uneven finish just makes it look more like skin. Given the very bright colors of my regiment's uniforms, I'm making my horses black. If you are using a darker color scheme, I would recommend something warmer or paler, like the traditional gray or white skin, or brown if you want something more warm. But since my main guard are already yellow and purple, it makes sense to go with something a bit darker for the contrast. I'm using Black Legion, of course, which is a very useful contrast that dries very flat and very dark in one color. Of course, I will be applying some layering to this afterwards, but just go through and be relatively careful. Don't have to be super cognizant with it, and just put this all over the skin of the horse. Remember, these guys don't have hair because they are not exactly horses, they're more distant relatives. And while I paint the skin, I might as well touch on the beasts that the Death Riders ride. The Death Riders ride on creatures that are not too distantly related from classic Terran horses, like the ones ridden by the Rough Riders. However, these are bred to be exceptionally mean. They've bred almost all the hair off of these creatures, including that on their tail, leaving them with only a stump. Their manes are almost completely gone, and their feet have moved from the hooved usual to a clawed broader foot to allow them to move across mud and other difficult terrain easier. Their legs are exceedingly powerful even compared to regular horses, allowing them to jump great distances to clear things like trenches. They are also known for their extremely poor temperament. These are inorganic beings grown in vats, under the watchful eye of a Magos biologist. Of course, they are very hardy, but given their unusual status as a being, they do need to be fed a consistent balance of chemicals to keep them not only fearless, but also controllable by their riders, which is what that tube is on its neck. It pumps the chemicals needed to keep the thing alive, as well as not go completely insane, as these beasts are renowned for being almost fearless. Whether it be gunfire or artillery, tanks, people screaming, it's very hard to scare a Death Rider's steed. You'd probably scare its rider before you scared it. Of course, these beings are churned out in massive numbers and branded, as you can see on its back left leg. This is to identify them, but these things are not expected to live very long as they charge headlong into the enemies. Though, for the very skilled riders, it's not unusual for them to have a horse for a decent amount of time. However, their unusual existence and status means that they'll usually either die from a lack of the proper chemicals, or simply because of how dangerous their position is. Of course, speaking of the horse, why don't we go on to talk about the core stats of the Death Riders while I finish up painting the skin. Their movement is fast at 10 inches, their toughness 4 thanks to being mounted on these sturdy horses. They have a 4+ save given the fact that the riders themselves wear carapace armor, or a similar equivalent to it, we'll cover that in a moment. They have 2 wounds, again, very nice, and they are leadership 7+, so merely average and OC 1. So this is a relatively hardy stat line, and since they come in at 70 points per 5, that's really not too bad. So roughly, what is that, 13 points a model or so? Overall, this is a very solid stat line for the Guard, and it only gets better with their equipment. Now, I will cover most of the weapons when we're talking about the riders themselves, but I did want to cover the fact that the horse, of course, comes with 1 extra weapon. That would be its Savage Claws, which have the extra attacks keyword, which means they cannot get extra attacks from any rules. And at base, they have 2 attacks with hit on 4s at strength 4, AP 1, and damage 1. This is effectively a couple extra chainsword attacks and really helps these guys against enemy infantry, which is where they want to be. Of course, while they cannot get extra attacks, thanks to the extra attacks keyword, they can benefit from fixed bayonets, for example. Anyways, that just about covers the horses. It's probably about time we move on. I did just want to quickly cover how I would highlight the skin, though we do have to let that contrast dry, of course. So before we do that, let's quickly cover the armor that these guys wear, and also how I'm going to paint it. Of course, the armor I'm going to paint up in purple, as all of the armor in my guard army is purple, because of course they're inspired by Wario, who is yellow and purple. I do use Vallejo Violet here, though it is rather purple. I'm not exactly sure why that's the name of it, unless I'm misremembering. The label has unfortunately rubbed off on that one. Of course, these guys do wear rather ornate armor for the guard. The main equipment in terms of armor is a plasteel chest plate that is for the most part ornamental, but being plasteel does offer quite a lot of protection for the rider itself, though it is very cumbersome. The rest of the armor is a mix of things like flak and carapace that offers them that better save. The horse is equipped with similar, mainly right on its forward chest, where it could, of course, where its ribs aren't protecting it, and on the gas mask that protects it from chemical warfare, which is a iconic piece of their war gear. There is slight armoring around the cranium, and also around the muzzle as well, where the filters and everything is, though the rest would be standard cloth. As I mentioned, the riders themselves wear heavier armor, the plasteel itself being very, very resilient but very heavy, so on recon missions it's not unusual for that to be removed, just to help save on weight, though of course if looking for pure survivability, there's hardly any armor in the guard that's better, so they are effectively wearing a kind of carapace armor. I of course did this in a few thin coats. I started with the horse mainly because it has less but larger pieces of armor, and I did leave some of the hard parts of the armor bare because I plan to make them metal, mainly the muzzle where the gas mask for the horse is. I did leave that bare because I just kind of thought the idea of that being a more practical piece of armor made sense, and also it just kind of struck me in the moment as something I wanted to do. This is again fairly standard. Do try to be more cognizant of where you're placing it here, more careful, though not the end of the world if you get it over, because as I mentioned, this is purple and yellow, though we do have a way of painting yellow extremely easily that we will cover, but before we do that, we do need to get on to highlighting the skin of the horse to make it look a little bit more visually interesting with some very simple and very forgiving highlights. We're going to be using Corax Black, which is a slightly off black that introduces some blue, bringing it to almost a sort of midnight color. Now, this is going to be very subtle, but you're just going to want to paint this over any of the sort of knobbly bits, that would be the joints, the toes, if you will, and then any of the raised musculature, especially on the haunches. You'll want to do a few coats of this. I also applied a few thin lines on the ribs, just to highlight those a little bit more. This will again be very subtle, but will make the black more impactful, and make it look a little bit more interesting, because black horses tend not to be like just full-on pitch black, but of course, like most black animals, there's some slight variation in the color there. So I think this just adds something and makes it look a little bit more realistic than just a almost like black quartz horse, even though that is rather cool, something very handsome Jack would make. This is very, very forgiving. Generally, I find skin much easier to highlight than armor, because you pretty much just highlight the raised parts of it, compared to armor, where you may have to do things like layered highlights, which are definitely fun to do, but not quite as relaxing as highlighting skin. And horses in general are quite easy to paint. If you were using a different color scheme for your horse, if you were, say, going for the pale color that we see on the box art, I would start from gray and then do this same step with something like a Ulthwyn gray, or maybe a Corax white if you want it to be really stark. Or if you're using brown, I would start with perhaps like maybe Rhinox hide, and then wash it with Agrax, and then mix in some Ushabti bone or flesh color into it to make a slightly brighter and not desaturated brown to highlight with. That's a general good rule of thumb. If you're not sure what to highlight with, mix in some flesh tone to whatever you're using. And sorry, I shouldn't say flesh tone. I should say like Caucasian flesh tone. Tan, if you will, into your paint, and that will brighten it up without desaturating it, which is what white does. We will be using that tip later on. Of course, you'll just go around. You don't have to hit every single area, just on the biggest, most noticeable areas that are easy to reach, which will also be easier to see, will be the ones that you really want to hit with these highlights. With that, it's time to move on to the next step, which is, of course, going to be add some depth to that armor. We're going to be using Druchii Violet, which is a purple wash from Games Workshop, to paint over all of the purple so far. This will bring the purple back more towards purple and away from blue, as well as seeking out the recesses and just adding in a lot of visual clarity. Excuse me, I'm not sure what happened right there with my voice. This is very simple. Washing is very easy. Just have a slightly wet brush, get your brush full, and then just run it all over the armor. If you see it pooling anywhere, just pull it away before it dries, and make sure to try and favor your brush in the crevices and recesses where it likes to pool the most, like above the eye ridges on the armor. You'll want to do this everywhere that's purple, so that'll be, again, the armor plates. I also made the boots purple, mainly because, while normally my boots are done in a dark green, the Death Riders are given special riding boots to be not only more comfortable while riding, but because, of course, you need riding boots to properly deal with a horse. So I decided to make those purple as well, mainly because in my regiment these guys are far less flashy than the usual guardsmen, at least in personality. So I think keeping their armor a little bit more mundane, despite its more ornate design, makes sense just from a fluff standpoint. Of course, I do love writing up fluff. We are going to move on to the next step, though. This one is very simple, and just make sure you let that wash dry before you do anything else with the armor, which should be fine, as we aren't going to be doing anything else with the armor for quite some time. Of course, the next step is the cloth of the uniform, as well as the gas mask on the horse, and it's going to be a bit of a cheat code for painting yellow. Now, painting yellow is notoriously difficult, especially in the past, but nowadays it's very simple, and this is the ultimate guide to do it. I figured this out a long time ago, and I am so thankful I did. What you're going to want to do is base everything that is going to be yellow with a Caucasian flesh tone, effectively. This is Vallejo's basic flesh tone, but I figure it just makes more sense to call it what it is. You could also use something like Ushabti Bone, but that's a little bit more pale. It won't add as much warmth to the yellow, and it won't be quite as solid. Or you could use Pale Sand, which is sort of the Vallejo equivalent. Any color in this family will work. I just find that the flesh tones, Caucasian flesh tones, tend to work the best, or what's labeled as a Caucasian flesh tone works the best. You're going to want to do this in two thin coats. I did over thin on the first coat, but then I just applied the second coat slightly thicker just to make sure everything would be nice and smooth, and it only took, again, 2 coats over this simple gray background. Now, there is some parts of this armor that's very hard to reach that has cloth underneath it. That would mainly be the collar around the neck, of course. That is very hard to reach, so you likely are going to mess up a little bit of your purple work, or whatever colors you're using. But that's not the end of the world, mainly because there are places that will be easy enough to highlight later and fix. So just keep that in mind. Don't sweat it if you get a little bit on the purple, because chances are you'll highlight over it later. And just make sure, again, that if you do catch it, you can do what I did here with my thumb and just wipe that away. And then make sure this is nice and smooth if you are wanting to paint any yellow. I use this for Space Marines, I use this for my guard. Anything that needs to be yellow, I always base with a Caucasian flesh tone first. Anyways, with that, let's move on to the next step. Next, we're going to pick out the claws for the horse itself, and I used Ushabti Bone for this, which is a little different than the flesh tone we were just using, as you can see here. Each claw has, I believe, each foot rather has 5 claws on it. Some of them are molded together, so just pick all of these out, and don't forget the ones, they're almost raptorial in the way they have claws right on their, where, like, their wrists would be. Technically, that's, like, their ankle, but whatever, you know exactly what I mean. This is very simple. Ushabti Bone's a pretty solid paint once you mix it up properly, so just apply a couple coats and leave it at that. We will be coming back to this later, though. Next, we're going to do all the leather. That would be, of course, the saddle, the scabbards, or whatever you want to call them, pouch for your rifles, or your power sabers if you built them with the lances. Personally, the lances I find would get bent up in my travel cases at the moment, so I went with the power sabers. I also think they look a little cooler. We're using hardened leather, which is a speed paint from the Army Painter, which is quite useful. I use it pretty much on every model. It's just a very nice, simple brown that gets the contrast effect across really well because it pulls from the edges in a great way that just makes it look very bright and warm, which is, again, a nice thing to add to contrast the other parts of the color scheme. This is pretty simple. Again, just pick out all of the leather straps, the stirrups, all of that, and let that fully dry, and then we will be ready to move on to the next step. I did also want to mention the instructions at the very end, in almost like a hidden step, recommend you put on some extra resources on their back straps near the tail, but I didn't see that, and I already primed them, so I didn't really want to go back and attach those. If you wanted to, again, they're mainly all leather pouches, so just use this color there as well. You can also hit the reins with this color, because, again, they're all leather. As well, I would also recommend hitting the backpack. I forgot to do that for a while. Again, not the end of the world, but it's time for us to move on to the next step, which is going to be the yellow. I use Bad Moon's Yellow, a contrast paint from Games Workshop, and just very simply apply this over all of the Caucasian flesh tone areas that I painted earlier. This, as you can see, just makes a very warm and nice yellow in one coat, and is very easy to fix. You just put down some flesh tone and then reapply this should you make any mistakes, and you're done. This is by far the easiest way to paint yellow that I know of. It's super smooth, super nice to use, and I would not be able to do this army if I didn't use it. You can apply this over basic gray or white. I just prefer not to, as it makes it look rather desaturated and starts to take on the blue of the gray underneath it when you do that. So I would recommend at least putting down one coat of a Caucasian skin tone before you apply this yellow, or just do it over pure white. But again, that makes it a little bit more cold, and I prefer the more warmth that the skin tone brings to the yellow. It just makes it punch really hard. And again, it's super easy to do. Thankfully, we live in the modern day where yellow is just, it's a cakewalk to paint yellow these days. Anyways, I figured it's probably about time we start covering the weaponry of the Death Korps, even though we aren't going to be painting that until the next step, so let's get into that. I used Leadbelcher for the metal parts of this model, so that would of course be the muzzle of the horse's gas mask, the nozzles on the chest plate for the horse, the canisters on the rider's backpack, the power saber, as well as the las carbine. And speaking of which, let's get right into that. First up, the las carbine. The las carbine is a weapon with the assault keyword. It has 2 attacks that hit on 4s at 18-inch range at strength 3, AP 0, and damage 1. This isn't the most impressive weapon by any means, but it's still useful enough for spraying at a few light infantry, or just to try and chip in wounds on something bigger, because you do get a decent quality of attacks, and assault is very nice, so they can advance when they won't have anything they need to charge at. The las carbine in lore is, unsurprisingly, the carbine variation of the las gun. It is shorter and a little bit lighter weight, usually having a folding stock, as we do see on this model. His carbine, though it is start away, does have a folding stock, which I quite like. I, in fact, saved all of the las carbine arms for when I inevitably make some Harakoni Warhawks. This weapon is very trusty and used mainly by recon units. Its range is lower, but its accuracy is just as good and fire rate slightly better than the standard las gun. And as you see, these guys do use extended or expanded las cells from the longer length of the one inserted into it. And this is a pattern of the Lucius pattern las gun cut down into a carbine, which is just the standard, slightly higher powered las gun variant used by the Death Korps of Krieg mainly. Of course, that is their only ranged weapon. They don't get any pistols like they used to, though in the lore they used to be equipped with las pistols. That seems to have gone the way of Forge World Resin with their new redesign. Of course, there is another weapon we are forgetting. The hunting saber is their secondary melee weapon, and certainly not their most popular, but is one that they now actually have more access to. This is a fairly short, though very maneuverable, power weapon used by the Death Riders, and its stat line is fairly standard, though admittedly very, very nice. For guard melee, that is. It's 3 attacks that hit on 3s, so very nice, at strength 4, AP 2, and damage 1. While not as many attacks as their lance, as we'll cover in a minute, this definitely does give it an edge against enemies with better saves, where the frag lance will struggle a little bit more. And speaking of the frag lance, that is most definitely their most popular weapon, though I already mentioned why I didn't build them, as I find lances tend to get warped a lot more in moving models when I'm taking them to the store. And I would like to note that the Death Riders do get both their power sabers and their frag lances. It's up to them which weapon they use. In the lore, though, they usually charge in with the frag lances, detonate the tips, and then pull out their cavalry sabers afterwards, as of course they would be more maneuverable in melee combat. But speaking of the frag lances, let's of course go over them now. Since I didn't model any of my horses with frag lances because I think the power sabers look cooler, here is a piece of artwork that shows what the frag lance looks like. It is a 3-meter long pole tipped with a replaceable explosive charge on a shaped pointed end. This is going to struggle against heavy armor, but given the fact that it can explode, and the way these usually work is they charge in, get them right in the enemy's face, and then detonate them, they work quite effectively against light and medium armored infantry, and also give them an element of sort of shock and awe when they charge into combat. In-game, they're represented by these stats. The frag lance comes in with the lance keyword, meaning when you charge, you get +1 to wound, and they have d6 attacks that hit on 3s at strength 4, AP 0, and damage 1. This means they're more effective against, again, lightly armored infantry, where it's more important that you wound them than piercing their armor. These would be more effective against things like orcs, or enemy shock troopers, for example, or large hordes, where the random number of attacks, of course, could lend to you having far more attacks, though of course there is always an element of randomness. But with 5d6 of these, you are likely to get just as many, if not more attacks. And lance does mean this helps them punch up against vehicles a little bit better, though they're still not much compared to, say, the melta lances of the Rough Riders, but the cavalry sabers are much better than the frag lances against armored enemies. The frag lance is useful, and making a masterful use of the Death Riders themselves will be knowing when to use the frag lances and when to use the power sabers. It's relatively simple. If they have a 3+ save and are toughness 4, you'll generally want to use the power sabers, or if they have a 2+ save, always the power sabers, but if they're higher toughness or have a mediocre save, the frag lances come into their own. Anyways, time to move on to the next step. Of course, I did paint the hilt of the sword with Balthasar gold, which is just a very deep bronzy gold that looks a little bit more worn and sturdy than regular gold, so I figured that would make a nice bit of touch, and also a nice extra splash of color. Anyways, time to move on. We use gray, administratum gray in particular, for the tubes on the gas mask of the horse, the gas mask on the rider, as well as the tubes that are pumping chemicals into the horse itself. This is just to base these for a later shade paint we're going to use, or rather a speed paint we're going to use later. And that will be Gravelord Gray, just put over the mane, the tubes for the gas masks, and that's just about it, though I also did use it as a wash for the silver metals, which we will get to later. Anyways, it's time to move on to the next step. We're going to start painting the eye lenses on the gas mask silver on the horse, mainly because the horse's eyes are larger, they're a good place to warm up. And then we use Incubi Darkness, a very dark blue-green color, to color in the lenses themselves. This, again, just adds in a lot of contrast and also wraps in the green color that is usually part of my color scheme, but is a little less prevalent here. So you're going to want to put this on both eyes of the gas mask for the horse, as well as the gas mask for the rider himself. Now this isn't all we're going to do, we are also going to be putting on a second layer. I also did apply this Cabalite green to the power sword's cable, as well as, again, the tube pumping chemicals into the horse's neck. I then layered onto the eye lenses of the horse and the rider and his power cable a little bit of Cabalite green, which is the usual green I use for boots. This, again, is just a sort of jadey emerald kind of green. It's a very pleasant color, though a little difficult to describe for me personally. Again, just brace your hands and put a little bit of that into the eye lenses of the rider. Did get a little bit too much on one of the eyes, but I think I nailed the other one pretty solidly, at least for my skill level. Then again, I also did apply this to the power cable on the wrist, and then I applied a different green to the power cable pumping, or the tube pumping fluid into the horse's neck. And that green is Moot Green by Games Workshop. This is a super vibrant green that just adds in a very intense splash of color and really makes it look like he's getting an injection of some sort of insane chemical. Reminds me a little bit of Venom from the Batman universe. Obviously, Bane's my favorite Batman villain, so I have no issues having the two correlate in that way. I suppose it is weird paying homage to him on a horse, but, sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do. Let's move on to the next step. That next step is going to be using Gravelord Gray or Basilicanum Gray from Games Workshop, Gravelord Gray from the Army Painter, and we're going to paint this over the tubes that are gray, so the one on the the rider and on the horse's gas mask. We're also going to apply this to all the silver surfaces. This gives us a lot of extra shading, while also dulling down the silver just a little bit to make it not quite such a bright shade. And while I do this, I figured I would cover the rest of the lore for the Death Riders. So as I mentioned in the intro, Death Riders are appraised for their exceptional way of being innovative, independent, and able to operate as an effective unit on their own, as they often are acting as recon or outflanking units. They'll be far from the chain of command, so they're expected to be very astute warriors, aware of their tactical place in the battlefield. This is often where the commanders or officers of the Death Corps come from, is from serving in the Death Riders, because if you survive here, you not only prove your worth with weaponry, you prove your worth in tactical positioning, knowing when to take a fight, how to take a fight, what equipment to use, so on and so forth. The Death Riders are the most flexible unit in the Krieg's arsenal. Because of their advanced speed and melee proficiency, they can really fill any role. Should a position be taken, the foot-mounted troops can, of course, defend it, while the Death Corps riders chase after the fleeing survivors to cut them down. Or, if there's a weakness in the enemy lines, the Death Riders can lead a valiant charge to break said line. Now, that's represented in-game not only in their high speed and, of course, being mounted, but also in their special rule. So, their special rule is Screening Line, which is once per turn when an enemy unit ends a move within 9 inches of this unit, whether that be normal advance or fall back. If this unit is not within engagement range, can make a normal move of up to 6 inches. This is super useful, as while these guys are pretty tough for guard standards, they're still rather squishy and prefer to take fights on their own terms. This means that close-range weaponry that need to be, again, up close and personal, or people that are looking to charge these guys, are going to be sorely mistaken when these guys run behind cover or simply run out of range of their weaponry. This is super useful and makes them a perfect utility unit alongside their pretty good melee damage. However, do keep in mind that you can just be outranged and this will do nothing, so don't be foolish in thinking you'll get this every turn. It is a little bit of a gotcha moment, but, you know, gotcha moments can be fun sometimes, and I'd say this is one of the least heinous gotcha moment rules in 40k at the moment. So just keep that in mind. Make sure you're watching where enemy units are moving near these guys, and try and position them in a way where if they can activate this, if it's even possible, it could be useful for them to run behind cover or something. But don't leave them just out in the open for no good reason. Otherwise, again, they could just get outranged of their reposition, which would be very, very unfortunate for you. With that, though, we've covered most of their core rules. I would like to also mention that they have the grenades keyword, which is useful on such a fast unit, to charge somewhere off into the distance, and then throw grenades at whatever it may be. While I am in the wash stage of this painting scheme, I also wanted to mention that I took a bit of creative liberty by changing the usual leather box of their respirator into a metal box that's built into their chest plate. That was mainly out of ignorance, but I kind of like the way it looks, and it keeps the look a little bit more consistent. Anyways, let's move on to the next step, which is one of our last. So, we have to do the very important step of basing. I'm using Vallejo's sort of mud earth paste. This stuff is pretty cheap compared to the usual small pots, as you get a big jar of it for about 20 bucks. I've been using the same one for probably 2-3 years now. This stuff is pretty standard to apply. Just get a sort of either old brush or one of these tools that GW sells for like 5 or 7 bucks, and then just scoop some on the base and spread it around. Now, I didn't really feel like painting up the rock, so I did kind of just end up covering that with the paste, which, again, just kind of looks completely indistinguishable. And be careful not to get this on any of the feet, as that would be just a shame to get that covered up. Though, again, it is pretty easy to remove if you just use a clean brush or the other end of the sculpting tool, or texture tool, I believe is its official title. This step is pretty standard, but is essential to getting your army battle ready. Thankfully, these guys tend to have very few connection points on their bases, which makes it very easy to do this, unlike something like the field ordnance batteries, which were an utter nightmare to get all the basing material on. Next up, we're going to move on to some very simple edge highlighting. I took the purple we used to base all the purple areas, and then I just mixed in a little bit of flesh tone, the same Caucasian flesh tone I used for the underbasing the yellow. And then I just put that on a small brush, loaded it up, and went around. I touched some of the more raised details, like the skull and wings on the chest plate, as well as turning the model around to edge highlight the edges of that armor relatively easily. You don't have to do anything too insane. Just a few spots here and there will sell the effect. And of course, remember, you'll never be able to do something if you don't practice it, so don't be worried about messing up. If you do, just go in and tidy up with the wash, usually, just because the color is so similar to the color we're highlighting on already. Again, I didn't do too much of this, mainly just on the horse's armor, the helmet of the rider, and then on the gauntlets. They have these raised areas. Those were super easy. Just use the side of your brush, and it is basically free highlighting. That just makes the the model look a lot more striking. I also put some very simple highlights on the boots, because again, they're purple as well. And then we'll move on to the next step of edge highlighting, which will be the sword. I used Grey Knight Steel, which is a very bluish metallic color. You can see me whipping the model around here, trying to find the best way to edge highlight it. And again, I just turned it to a way I found comfortable and used the side of my brush to hit the blade edge. I also hit the back sort of corners, and then I was a little bit brave and I did the sort of bevel where the sword comes to its point and the little node of power. The middle highlight on the sword was a little shaky, but I'm not too upset with it. It's hard to notice, really. And overall, again, you have to practice these things to get better at them, so I'm relatively happy with how it came out. And I also did the same things on the back side of the sword, and with that, we are just about done, except for one tiny bit of freehanding. Forgot to mention, I painted the gloves with the color we're going to use to freehand, white blue from Pro Acryl. I also washed the hands with Apothecary White. So we're going to put the W insignia on this guy's shoulder pad. Basically just 4 lines done with a fine brush. This definitely came out very wobbly, but you can cut back in with the purple and it looks pretty much fine. Not the proudest with how this came out, but again, you're never going to get any better at things unless you fail a couple times. And it's not so egregious it looks that awful, and from the tabletop distance it looks completely fine. This is of course exclusive to my silly little regiment, which, while I freehand it, I'll give a little bit of fluff for. They were sent off on a siege mission, as they are a siege regiment. That's why they wear such insane colors. And were cut off from the light of Astronomicon, as well as contact with the Imperium. Trapped on a frozen world, they ended up getting attacked by what appeared to be Ultramarines. Though, of course, this was a false flag operation by their saviors, the Alpha Legion, who descended and defeated the oncoming Space Marine invaders and told them they were some of the last true servants of the Emperor. Any opposition to them was, of course, promptly removed by the Alpha Legion and replaced with their own leaders. And then they used the regiment as their own mortal army, alongside helping them reestablish the dead planets they were on to make them into an effective war factory. They do still send off their tithe and things like that to make sure the Imperium doesn't hound them too badly, but they are, of course, going on their little crusade to save the Imperium, as they call it. Nothing major, just a little bit of fluff, because I love making fluff. For example, I'm a forever DM when I play Dungeons & Dragons. Anyways, it's time to go into our little spinning tabletop show. And here we are. So, I really enjoyed painting this model. One other note is I did wash all the yellow with Cassandora Yellow, which is a wash. Just load it up with a little bit of water, and then just put that everywhere all over it, and I think it added a lot of great definition. Overall, I'm very happy with how this guy came out. I really enjoyed painting this model. It was super fun. I thought it might be a little complicated or difficult, but I found him very fun to paint. And I hope you enjoyed the little tidbits of lore, and while we didn't cover all the rules here, such as their leaders, I think that's completely fine. Eventually I'll do videos for Lord Solar or Lord Marshal Dreer at some point. But if you enjoyed this video, make sure to let me know what you thought down below, and tell me what you thought. This is, of course, a new style of video I'm doing, and it's something I enjoy a whole lot more than my usual prattling on about Space Marine units, though I do plan to actually do a Space Marine video probably tomorrow. Anyways, see y'all next time.